So can you speak about language because you also studied that in Mitzvah Girls?
Yes. So Hasidim, in contrast to other ultra Orthodox groups, speak three languages. They use Lashon Kodesh or liturgical Hebrew, which is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic of the text. They use Yiddish and they use English. These are gendered, usually with men speaking more Yiddish in most communities than women, although Satmar women speak a lot of Yiddish too. And the Yiddish that's spoken today in Brooklyn and many places has a lot of English borrowings from it. So people speak these three languages. One of the signs that somebody was starting to live a double life, in fact, for men, was that their English got much better. Because if you're in yeshiva all day, even as a married man, you're studying religious texts all day, your English shouldn't be too good. If your English is really good, it means you're reading, maybe you're watching movies in English. And so I heard a story from one person who was set up with a match and it was a remarriage after a divorce, and the potential bride rejected him because his English was too good, and she was suspicious of where he stood in terms of his faith, and I guess she was right. But one of the things that I found very interesting was the way that the internet actually had an impact on Yiddish in a productive way. Like you would expect the internet to improve people's English. That's not surprising. And especially for Hasidim and other kinds of ultra Orthodox Jews, English was the lingua franca. In some of the early J blogosphere posts, sometimes Hasidic Jews would write stuff in Yiddish and English letters before there were easy access keyboards. And then other people would say, well, write that in English for those of us who are not Hasidic. So there was a push to really speak in English so that everyone could communicate, and for women too, because Hasidic men's Yiddish, this was tricky for me too, is filled with references to religious texts in liturgical Hebrew, in Lashon Kodesh. And I don't have that background. So men's Yiddish was really hard for me to read. I had to get a translator to help me with that. But what surprised me was that Yiddish started to change because around like, I would say maybe like 2010 and onward, once there you could easily access a Yiddish letter keyboard, it became increasingly easy to write Yiddish in Yiddish letters or Hebrew letters. And suddenly, what I found was that some of the chat rooms and discussion boards and other social media sites began to be Yiddish only. There's one in particular that I talk about called Kavashtibel, which is for mostly for men. You have to write in Yiddish in it. You can't write in English. Um, and so that kind of excludes a lot of women. And the Yiddish, again, has a lot of liturgical Hebrew in it. But because this was a place where there was less censorship, like there were other sites for very frum Jews that as soon as you mentioned something a little open minded, like a little, or made reference to secular material or reading, there would be quick censorship. Kavashibel was a little more open about how long they would leave up something that was a little more questioning. And some places use filters actually to block Kavashibel. Because there was a sense that they were writing about all kinds of issues, Yiddish began to be used for different purposes. Like it wasn't, you know, ultra Orthodox men read a line in Hebrew and they translate it into Yiddish and then they discuss it. But here, people were expressing their private interior beliefs. They were writing poetry about natural beauty or love in Yiddish. One person translated a Taylor Swift song into Yiddish. Like they were talking about all kinds of things, but they were the authors. And I know you know um, Katla Kanya, who is a famous blogger, who has a beautiful Yiddish, who translated a lot of English language poetry into Yiddish, especially Robert Frost's poem about which direction to go, and another one stopping in the woods on a snowy night. And those kinds of uses of Yiddish for personal expression and the kind of comfort with writing actually, I think, has been changing the Yiddish, like Hasidic Yiddish language structurally, but also in terms of ideologically, like what people think Yiddish is for and what it should be for. And I tracked some really, with the help of my of one of my translators, who's Rose Waldman, who's a Yiddish translator. She helped me follow Kavish Tibel, and we followed, for example, um, a really interesting post where one of the posters asked, like, how are we going to make plural in Yiddish? Or like, how are we going to mark, not how are we going to make plural, more like, how are we going to mark when a word is from English and then we're going to integrate it into Yiddish? Or are we going to just leave it in its English letters? Or are we going to just leave it as English? Or are we going to add a Yiddish suffix, for example? So there was a lot of what I would call metapragmatic, which is talk about talk. There was a lot of that about Yiddish. And I think like now it's quite common to have Yiddish magazines for children that are entertainment, not so much like Malos. You always had Malos, but that was like also about like morally didactic, a little bit more like building up ethics. You have a lot of like just pure entertainment magazines now in Yiddish. And I think that's a direct outcome of the internet and lots of people writing in Yiddish, men in particular. And just a year or so ago, there was a fascinating meeting of these editors from magazines, Yiddish magazines and newspapers who were thinking like, do we need to standardize Yiddish? Like Hasidic Yiddish, do we need to have like a book or like, can we agree on certain ways that we spell certain letters, certain words? Because one of the things that's been super interesting as a linguistic anthropologist is that standard Hasidic Yiddish has no standard, right? Like there's no, I mean, you learn Yiddish if you're a girl, you don't really learn it as a language as a boy. And there's lots of ways that you can spell certain words. You can have a hey or not a hey. It's not a big deal. You can, transliterate English words, apartment, into Yiddish letters. That's all fine. So I've been in my first book, I talked about the ways that actually girls and women in particular made English Jewish through accent and spelling and Yiddish letters. Here you have a kind of reclaiming of language and saying Yiddish is as good as any other language, which could be a dangerous, actually, language ideology because it means Jewishness is a religion or a culture like any other culture or language. So it's a double edged sword. It's both preserving Yiddish, but it is introducing this idea that, we have experts in Yiddish, and Yiddish is just a language like any other language. It's not necessarily holy. You can express lots of heretical ideas in Yiddish.
I heard a very interesting lecture from Chaya Novi, who I'm sure you've
Mm,
heard of, who
yes.
is an academic.
I'm a big fan of
Well,
hers.
she was actually my teacher, and she's amazing, and I wish that, hopefully one
Brilliant.
day I'll get to interview her here as
You
well.
should.
But something I heard that was very interesting that, like, stayed with me in a lecture she gave in Yiddish is she asked the question, why if the Satmar Rabbi, the first Satmar Rabbi, after the Holocaust, as he was building the community in New York, if he was so adamant to get the community to speak Yiddish because a lot of people were speaking Hungarian, and he
Yes.
was really pushing people out of their language comfort zone, especially women, and encouraging them to speak Yiddish at home. Why, if Yiddish was so important to him, did he and his people not create standardized texts? Why didn't they
Right.
create grammar books if Yiddish was so important? And she answers that because he had to make sure that his pressure to preserve Yiddish was completely distinct from Yiddishist, secular Yiddish efforts,
Exactly.
which is like
Yes.
mind-boggling. Like the job of the original revivalists of Hasidic Yiddish was really difficult. They had to reject Hebrew, they had to reject English, they had to reject Hungarian, they had to reject secular Yiddish.
Yep.
And what you were left with was a hodgepodge grammar. But now, to your point, there's a whole thing going on Twitter in Yiddish. It's like a whole Yiddish world. And
Yep.
I gave a talk at the Yale Yiddish program, and they said that they every day they log on to Twitter and they look at Hasidic One, which is a popular. You
I
follow
follow
him.
him. Yeah.
And it's like crazy. He's so comfortable in Yiddish. Like it's easy to read his Yiddish. It uses a lot of English. It feels like something new is happening, and it seems to me to
Yeah.
be the next phase from Kava Stiebel. Like Kava Stiebel, of course, is still creating amazing stuff, but it's
Yeah.
like something is happening to what you were explaining.
I totally agree, and it's unexpected because, for so many years, coming out of Yiddishists, like, who, have amazing scholarship, and but, like, Yiddish was a dying language for so many years, and Yiddishists, that's when I started doing my research, there was almost no research on Hasidic Yiddish because it was considered like it was different. It didn't follow standard Yiddish, and the Yiddishists were so invested in creating a Yiddish standard, the secular Yiddishists. And yeah, she's totally right. And I do think something very exciting is happening, and it sort of counters some of the bad rap that the internet gets as like a homogenizing force, where instead you have a minoritized language, Yiddish, really
Yeah.
flourishing.
There's so much more to talk about that. You wanna say just a few final words about Mitzvah Girls, what your research was? You touched on it, but I think there's more to say.
Sure. So that was my first book, and it came out of my dissertation. And it was a study of mothers and daughters, particularly little girls and their mothers. I started out really wanting to focus on Yiddish because what some of my early research showed was that um, after age 6, I was predominantly in a little girls' school. After around first grade, girls stopped speaking Yiddish and really wanted to speak English. And I was curious why that was. And I noticed that their mothers spoke a lot of English among themselves and to their daughters while they spoke Yiddish to their sons. I think that's quite different, probably, from how you grew up. But I was like, what's going on here? Do little girls want to leave? Like, do they think it's cooler to speak Yiddish?
English.
And that, I mean, English, sorry. Yeah, English. And that question led me into all kinds of different directions than I had expected to go. And I looked across the life cycle in that book from little girls through brides who were going to bride class and getting married. And I looked at the ways that young little girls learn to embody certain ways of being Hasidic and the ways that language played into that. And in fact, the ways that English was most important for distinguishing themselves from boys. So it was a kind of feminine language, and also from other kinds of Hasidic girls who were considered Nevi, or like
Not
not
so
so
cool.
cool, nerdy, maybe.
Yeah. Oh, those distinctions are so important. Did you like study stuff
Yeah.
like the enunciation of L? Like for me in Yiddish, there's a difference between saying ich läuf kaufen a Kleid and ich läuf kaufen a Kleid. One is like nerdy.
Oh, it's fancy. Well, that was the other thing I got really curious about, like what makes some language sound more fancy. So I had to take up this idea about modern, the idea of what modern is, and how it's negative, and yet it also has a certain prestige. So when a from woman with a Boston accent, for example, came to the little girls' school, her accent was considered so
Wow.
fancy, like she had a Boston accent. It wasn't very fancy, but it was different and it was outside what people thought. And I think there was a very ambivalent idea toward education. I looked a lot at the ways that little girls use their autonomy. They come, like, growing up is a process of using your autonomy to actually fit in to expected Hasidic women's norms. It was a moment in time too where a lot of academics were talking about agency, especially for women in very religious communities, and like, were they oppressed? Were they not oppressed? And so one of the things I was curious about was, if girls were speaking Yiddish, were they rebellious? And it turned out that they weren't, that in fact, that was part of, also, not only were they distinguishing themselves, but that was part of a historical legacy where their Hasidic community didn't have schools that were Yiddish medium when their mothers went to school. And so they were like third generation, and their mothers weren't that fluent in Yiddish. In order to really have the kinds of conversations that they wanted to have with their daughters, they needed to use English. But by the same token, girls came to think that English was fancy and grown up and like a big girl. And so I was really interested in all of these associations between language and other ways of belonging. And so I also looked a lot at how girls learn to be modest, um, and what happened when girls asked the wrong kinds of questions. I have a lot of work on not only language itself, but the way people interact in terms of like question asking, shutting down questions, disciplining girls, things like that.
Fantastic. Both your books are amazing. And I'm
Thank
gonna
you.
give a shout out again. You can find Ayala's books, Hidden Heretic, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age, and Mitzvah Girls.
Yeah.
What is it? Bringing up
The next generation of Hasidic
the
girls
next
in Brooklyn.
generation of Hasidic girls in Brooklyn. Where can people get it? Just anywhere?
Just on Amazon
All right, great.
or from the Princeton University
Okay.
website too.
Princeton University Press. Great. Um,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ayala. It was fantastic to talk to you. I really appreciate you sharing
Thank you
everything.
so
Yeah.
much, Frida.